Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem at any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.
A galaxy of stories. In cosmic cliffs, womb of dust and gas, a story is born. A stellar nursery is a blazing birthplace for remembering, for forgetting. A galactic collision of time and place in a glittering skyscape, carved from clouds of cosmic ash by rays of light and stellar winds. If a story is a star, then history is a galaxy of hundreds of billions of stars, warping space, stretching light from the early universe, hurtling towards my eyes.
Elfie Shiosaki is a Noongar and Yawuru writer. Elfie is an associate professor at the College of Arts and Social Sciences at the Australian National University and was the editor of Indigenous Writing for Westerly, a literary magazine featuring fiction, non-fiction and poetry produced at the University of Western Australia. Today I'm talking to Elfie about her new book of poetry, Refugia. Elfie, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Last time we spoke, we talked about homecoming and the story tree, a story tree of family and connection. And that's what underpinned that wonderful book. What came through to me then was the warmth of that storytelling. Refugia presents us with something quite different. A galaxy of stories is how the book begins. How and why has your storytelling world expanded?
I really like to think of my storytelling world expanding up into the sky country now. That's a beautiful way of reflecting on the framework of the book. My desire to write about the stars is connected to one of the beginnings of Refugia, which is the first year of science from NASA's James Webb Space Telescope. In the process of writing the poems for Refugia, I was also in this parallel process of really enjoying the science that was being published from the Webb telescope and really expanding my own understanding of the formation of the first stars and galaxies. I was already in this expansive space, I think, when I was enjoying the images of the first stars and galaxies that were being published throughout the year when I was writing. And I was really captured by the idea that the Webb telescope was seeking new understandings of something, new understandings of our galaxy. And I think in the same way, Refugia is seeking new understandings of the formation of the Swan River colony in Western Australia. And we're at the point now where the colony is about to commemorate its 200th anniversary. And this to me seemed like a good time for our community in Western Australia to seek new understandings, which really privilege Noongar voices and stories.
And I really want to talk about that bicentennial, if we can call it that, a little bit later. But first I want to ask you about the title of the book, Refugia. As poetry intends, its meaning and intention are quite intriguing. And yours is a slightly different perspective on that term.
My understanding of this term refugia is that it comes from environmental studies and that it is a term that's used to describe an ecosystem that has survived climate crisis and catastrophic change over millennia. And this collection of poetry really reflects on survival. And so I felt a connection to that term of refugia, which is speaking of how ecosystems survive catastrophic change. And in some ways, I began to envisage the Noongar nation and country as a place that had survived catastrophic change. And I think what I find so poetically inspiring about the term of refugia is that it speaks to cultural strength and resilience, that despite catastrophe, a remnant of the culture remains. And in writing Refugia, I think one of my aims was to celebrate the survival of the Noongar nation and to celebrate our families and communities as this very precious remnant.
White history tells us that one Captain James Stirling is the father of the Swan River colony, but the piece titled My Fathers reminds me that, and I quote here, retrograde amnesia blooms in the mind, corroding and pitting truths into flaky and brittle knowledge.
I think that poem, My Fathers, really explores the beginnings of the state of Western Australia. And in my research and teaching, I'm really involved in an area of research about Indigenous nation building. And in this area of research, we're really wanting to reflect on the beginnings of a nation and also, or a national political community, and also how we remember these beginnings, how they become parts of national narratives and national identity. And when I began to write Refugia, I was actually writing in an international writers group of poets who were performing at a poetry festival in Birmingham in parallel to the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham in 2022. And I was writing with poets that are from Commonwealth nations or former Commonwealth nations. And I was writing in a group of incredible poets from places like Jamaica, India, Malaysia. And we were really getting to know each other and sharing in this international setting who we were and where we came from. And so I was really trying to explain to them the beginnings of Western Australia, where I was from, the beginnings of the Noongar Nation. And I noticed in some research that I was doing that Captain James Stirling was often referred to as the founding father of Western Australia. And that concept of him being described as our founding father really troubled me, because obviously there was a very ancient community that lived on Noongar Country for tens of thousands of years before he first arrived in 1827 and before he established the Swan River colony in 1829. I found it contentious because there was nothing fatherly about the way that Captain James Stirling treated Noongar people when he arrived in the colony. The colony very quickly descended into violence and retributive killings, and he was himself responsible for acts of massacre which are recorded in government archives in Western Australia. It's actually recorded in the Perth Gazette as a celebration of his success in claiming land. And so I found that concept of Captain James Stirling being the founding father very troubling. And I thought that surely now, almost 200 years on from the founding of the colony, that as our own political community in Western Australia, we would not want to consider Captain James Stirling to be a founding father of ours, that we would want to be more critical of his actions in the colony, and that we would want to celebrate what a gift the Noongar Nation has given us in terms of tens of thousands of years of caring for the beautiful country that is Noongar Boodja, and for continuing to give us great knowledge and stories about how we care for country, how we live in a sustainable way.
And I think you extend that idea through another work, Venerate, Good, Not Evil, and a very interesting rewriting of an epitaph that appears on a statue of Captain James Stirling, curiously erected as recently as 1979. What did you want to awaken people to in the rewriting of that epitaph?
Obviously, we're having a national conversation about statues around Australia and the way in which we commemorate, in particular, European people who came to colonies. And to me, it seems to be an area where more community education is needed about the lives of the people that we choose to commemorate, and in particular, their treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the archive so clearly accounts for James Stirling's acts of violence and acts of massacre. And so to me, it seemed really absurd that less than 50 years ago, as the state of Western Australia was commemorating its 150th anniversary, that it chose to erect this statue of James Stirling on Hay Street in the CBD, and to venerate him in that way without speaking of the truth of who he was and how he treated Aboriginal people. So in the collection, I attempt to rewrite a more truthful account of what it is we're commemorating, to really point to the absurdity of it all, because the archive shows that Captain James Stirling was a criminal. He committed acts of massacre, and that he didn't necessarily build a national political community in Western Australia. He was responsible for tearing one down, one that already existed, the Noongar Nation. And we don't, from my perspective, I was reflecting on how rarely we have this conversation about Australian historical figures that we choose to commemorate, and to look at their life as a whole rather than looking only at the political positions that they held.
As I understand it, that statue of Captain James Stirling has blood on his hands, both figuratively and literally these days.
That's right. I think it was vandalised in 2019 as Perth really began to be mobilised around the Black Lives Matter movement, and we began to have more discussions around the ethics of the statues that we commemorate in our city.
Let's move forward a century or so. Here's a name that might ring some bells to many Australians, Daisy Bates, Kabali, as I think she was known. The best known of her books is The Passing of the Aborigines. You've written about it through a piece called Kingdoms. And in this poem, you scream into the spine of that book, The Passing of the Aborigines. Why did you scream into the spine of that book?
It sounds very dramatic, doesn't it? I think so many Noongar researchers, Aboriginal researchers around Australia are really delving into the archives of Daisy Bates, because she produced hundreds of pages of writing about Aboriginal culture and in particular Aboriginal kinship networks. And the reality of the situation is that the research that was done in these early colonial periods in Australia by anthropologists like Daisy Bates, who was self-trained, which is why she's described as self-proclaimed anthropologist later in the book, was that they were implicit in the practice of colonisation in Australia. So on one hand, you had a wave of British military arriving with their warships and their cannons and their guns and their military technology, but you also had a wave of scientists arrive. And when they arrived, they were studying not only country, but also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And a lot of their scientific research was used to legitimise colonisation. In particular, it was used to support theories of race at the time, which made these false claims that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were somehow inferior to European people, that somehow they could not be lawful and sovereign people. Daisy Bates's research on Aboriginal people can't be separated from that reality, and that she was really collecting knowledge about Aboriginal people, classifying it from her own worldview, from a very Western gaze, and then reflecting that back to the empire. And I find some of her research really derogatory, very problematic, but it's also a site of reclamation because, for example, she has recorded things like a Noongar language list, a Noongar dictionary. So there's some information that's vitally important for Noongar people. There's some information about our genealogies that are vitally important, but they've been produced in a very problematic context, and her representation of us is very problematic. Her work needs to be viewed with a more critical lens. The information that she provides as, say, truthful and valid, we need to be more critical about that. And I guess what I was really taken by when I was looking at her work was how she not only classifies country and culture, but she also adopts these ways of describing Noongar people. And for Noongar people in the Swan River, she uses this word beeliar to describe the people of the Swan River. And I felt like that was so comprehensive in a way to claim someone's name. to name and claim who they were and their identity. And it felt very obtrusive to me, which prompted the reaction in the poem that I would scream in the reading room of the library while I was looking at her papers.
This leads me to another phrase that you use, and I think it might relate quite closely to the work of Daisy Bates and Captain James Stirling. We've built our house on shaky foundations.
That micro poem, in a way, appears as part of my reflections on how we remember the Swan River colony, how we remember the history of the colony, how Aboriginal people were treated within the colony, and how we remember some of the key foundations of our national political community in Western Australia. So the poetry collection looks at some of our founding documents, like the West Australian Act from 1829, now held in the National Parliamentary Archives in the UK. And in the Act, it proclaims that His Majesty at the time, the British Empire, is effecting a settlement upon what they describe as, quote, wild and unoccupied lands. And it seemed to me that that law was enshrining an untruth, because Noongar Budja was neither wild nor unoccupied. So I started to see how the beginnings of our story as a state of Western Australia were really founded on untruths. And that made me, I guess, reflect in that micro poem that the foundations of our community were built on very shaky grounds. Bicentennial never. 200 years is time the stars do not count. 200 years is time vanishing in their twinkle. Swan River colony, when you have cared for the beeliar, when you have safeguarded its fresh waters from pollution, when you have protected the nesting grounds of its water birds, when you have given our children clean water to drink, for millennia, for uncountable time, for the lifetime of a star. Then I will gather on the banks of the beeliar as the full moon rises over the hills to celebrate, to count the time. From my perspective, this poem reflects on the longevity of Noongar culture, one of the oldest continuing cultures in the world, and that Noongar people cared for country for tens of thousands of years before European people arrived and established the colony in 1829. So it seems to me that the lifetime of the colony is quite short compared to the tens of thousands of years of culture that existed on Noongar Country before that. And so my reflection on the bicentenary is really just a question. What are we commemorating in 2029? What are we celebrating? And it's not to say that there's nothing to celebrate, but what comes to my mind is that there are tens of thousands of years of history to celebrate in Western Australia, and that over that period of tens of thousands of years, which I describe as the lifetime of a star, that Aboriginal people in Western Australia did incredible work to protect and preserve country, to ensure that its fresh waters were unpolluted, to protect its water birds, to ensure that children had clean water to drink. And I'm so grateful for their custodianship, their careful custodianship of country. And from that perspective, I can see how much damage has been done to country in only 200 years, which is a short period of time when you think about the longevity of Noongar culture, and how we're now coming to a point where we have water scarcity, where our fresh waters are polluted. And this poem really reflects, I think, my sadness about that, that so much has been lost in such a short period of time, and a concern that some of this environmental damage is now, as some researchers are telling us around the wheat belt areas of Western Australia, are irreversible. And so this poem is less a sort of scathing comment about the colony and more about a sadness of what has been lost and what damage has been caused, and that damage is now irreversible.
The architecture of Refugia is something worth reflecting on too. It's in three sections: bend, break, and the final section, bud, which begins with from ashes. This section takes the work in a new direction. Where are we headed?
I think I felt a real responsibility to the reader to do the work that I did in Bud, because the first two sections of the collection are really, they discuss histories that are really difficult to contend with. And they discuss themes of are really around dispossession and grief and trauma. And I wanted to reflect on the possibility of contending with those painful histories and finding a pathway to move through them, to potentially heal from them, and to explore possibilities of a new beginning. And the poem From Ashes actually was inspired by the philosophies of Timor-Leste's Prime Minister, Janana Guzmão. I used to work in Dili in Timor-Leste. I was there for 3 years. And the period that I was there, Timor-Leste was going through a process of truth and reconciliation after its experience of invasion and by the Indonesian military, and then colonization by the Portuguese. And at that time in Timor-Leste's history, Prime Minister Janana Guzmão had a philosophy of forgiveness. And the poem responds to his call to his people, which is this: forgive each other, forget the past, let us build the nation from ashes once again. And as a much younger person, when I was living there and witnessing this moment in Timorese history, I thought that Janana Guzmão was asking too much of his people to forgive each other and to forget the past. But as I have become older and hopefully a little wiser, I think I have begun to understand perhaps what he meant. And I find his comments less controversial because I've had some lived experience of not forgiving the past, not moving on from the past. And it means that you live with this grief and this trauma in your body. And I think that's too much of an ask, to live your whole life with that grief and that trauma. And I understand now this call to kind of contend with history, not deny its pain, but to find a way to move through it and to find a way to forgive. And this is just my personal reflections, because it moves you to this place of the possibility of a new beginning. We don't often speak of forgiveness in our human rights discourse, in our human rights culture, but I think there's some power there, because whether or not somebody expresses remorse, whether somebody asks you to forgive them, we have this agency and this ability to forgive, which means that you're releasing that grief and trauma from your body, and you're maybe embracing much more compassion and kindness for yourself and exploring a new possibility, because we're in this space, particularly on Noongar Country, where the Noongar Nation is rising. The Noongar Nation has signed a settlement with the West Australian government in 2021, which is often described as Australia's first treaty. So we're now moving into this period of self-governance. We're setting our development agendas. We're pursuing our development outcomes. We're revitalising our governance structures. We're in this place of a kind of new beginning that we're exploring. And our young people are coming through really filled with their culture, learning their language. And the young people that I work with in my research and teaching, they have so much cultural strength and resilience. And you can see that the future of the nation is really safe in their strong hands. And so this theme of within Bard about rising from the ashes is really reflecting my hope, but also some realities from the ground that both the people and the nation can rise again.
Elfie Shiosaki, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and thanks so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been talking to Elfie Shiosaki about her new book of poetry, Refugia. It's published by Magabala Books, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading Podcast was brought to you by Book People Gift Cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.